In a future where freedom is nothing more than an illusion and the Avengers are nothing but a memory, we see old man Steve Rogers forced out of retirement. Young or old, everybody's day starts the same way. You have to open your eyes, even on the days that you don't want to, and most mornings before Steve Rogers hears his Rosa's voice, he really doesn't want to. With a kiss on the cheek and a cup of coffee in bed, Rosa is being extra nice to him today. She's hoping that Steve doesn't remember what today is. But this world, this future, could never let him forget. But no matter how different or strange this world may seem, there's always one thing you can count on, and that is a good friend. See Steve meeting with Matt Murdock and Luke Cage in the park because, after all, today is H Day. Now, Steve immediately asks Matt how things are going, and he tells them it's horrible. He's overrun with cases. This new Watcher Act they've implemented has turned every kid with an old camera phone into a quote-unquote criminal. On top of that, there's the curfews, which is ridiculous because Hydra's not even a threat anymore, but Steve tells Matt to remember that he's a good man. And Matt tells him, yeah, somebody's got to do something. Steve argues that he tried. He ran for office before, and the voters showed him exactly what they thought about him. Just an old soldier looking for days far gone, and even though he doesn't have the super soldier serum anymore, he still takes the time to volunteer at the Veteran Center, at food banks, and he asks Luke what the hell he's doing. But Luke tells them not to worry about it, that he has his own stuff going on. They tell Steve that he was a symbol, he has a voice, but the problem with this is that people voted for this over and over again. This is what they wanted. Later, while fixing dinner, we see Steve telling Rosa about all of this, about how Luke and Matt were guilt-tripping him, about not doing enough anymore. And Steve sees it, the documentary about the Red Skull, the misunderstood figure of World War II. The truth about Johann Schmidt is finally going to be revealed to the world. He actually tried to take everything down from inside the Third Reich. Rosa tells Steve not to pay attention, that they're just trying to work up some fake controversy and don't give it his time or energy. Storming off, Steve says that nobody gives a damn about the truth anymore, and as he heads to his bedroom and grabs an old picture of the Avengers, he can't help but think to himself how nobody cares, period. You can see James Stark sitting in the top of his ivory tower watching old footage of his dad. Kyle Jarvis arrives and tells James that he could do a lot more good than his dad ever did if he would just agree to be Iron Man. Jarvis, disappointed by the state of, well, everything in James's life right now, tells him that he raised him much better than this. The tongue lashing is going to have to wait. After all, the president is needing to speak to James, and FBI has alerted them that they might need James's help talking down an old friend. An old friend who has made his way onto the nightly news. Now we see Steve getting mic'd up for his big appearance. He's shocked to see that he's not the only one appearing on the show tonight. As James Stark takes the stage, the host introduces Steve Rogers, Captain America, the old man, to everyone watching at home, and then to James Stark, the CEO of Stark Industries and the son of Iron Man and the Wasp, who, as it would turn out, has arrived to berate his Uncle Steve for trying to shut down free speech. He accuses Mr. Rogers of only slinking out of retirement when it's his legacy in danger of being tarnished. Tells Steve that him and his father and all of the other Avengers painted the world as black and white, heroes and villains, and then they brought them a national tragedy, Hero Day. Day of reckoning for the superpowered community, hundreds dead, the city of Boston leveled. James Stark calls this the day that the world woke up. Heroes, villains, it didn't matter what the label was, all they all led to was countless death and destruction. Bruce Banner, the Hulk, was a founding Avenger. He was uncontrollable. Hank Pym created the monstrous AI Ultron. And now they're just supposed to take Steve Rogers' word that he's telling the truth about the Red Skull? Storming off the set, Steve tells Jimmy that he knows the difference. He knows what a hero looks like. It looked like his mom and dad. All he's busy doing is trying to tarnish their legacy so he doesn't look so hollow in comparison. Steve's trying to tell himself to calm down, that his heart isn't what it used to be. In the midst of his panic, we see him reliving that fateful day of him and the Avengers arriving to Boston, looking like a bomb had already leveled the city. Having to console Spider-Man as with his dying breath he tells Steve that he did it, that he saved his Aunt May, but he just asks that he keeps her safe. He snapped back to reality all of a sudden when the armed guards in the streets tell him that he needs to get home, that it's almost past curfew. Before Steve can even walk away, he sees the guards moving on to a group of kids breaking the law by recording. Steve watches as the guards harass these kids, and he tells himself to think of his heart, to think of Rosa. He can't help here. He's an old man. He's an old idea. But taking his glasses off, he also tells himself that he's fought in wars. He knows that men like these, when they're not abusing old people and children, crumple like paper. As his knee gives out on him and he gets hit in the back of the head, unfortunately, spunk was about all this old man had left. The guards beat the hell out of him, laying there on the ground. He all of a sudden gets saved by a group of strangers. While all this is going on, we see James Stark arriving at the raft to address some old family business as we see him talking to his father, who is nothing more than a floating head in a tank. We then see Steve being taken back to meet his guardian angel as he opens his eyes and sees Luke Cage sitting in front of him. Now, the Defenders tell Luke that they don't think the old man's going to be on board, but he assures them that he will be because, after all, he's Cap, and they're at war. Luke quickly breaks the news to Cap that even though they just saw him today, Matt is dead. Luke breaks it down plain and simple for Steve. He tells him that things may look fine on the surface out there, but underneath, it's nothing but rot. S.H.I.E.L.D. and the government are squashing any kind of political dissent before it could even start up. The new Avengers are overseas laying waste to foreign countries. The reason he doesn't know is the news, the internet, everything is bought and controlled. Luke and his people are trying to get the truth out there, but they really need someone to rally around, and there's only one person for a job like that. Luke reveals that he has another secret as we see him offering Steve his old life back. Tells Steve that his bulletproof skin in his old age has made him almost immovable. Matt died trying to help people that the system was trying to make disappear. Then one of the defenders hands Steve a file showing him pictures of the abuse that's happening to Americans right here on our own soil. And sees Steve calling and leaving Rosa a message telling her that he won't be home for a while. He's okay, but there's something he needs to do. He needs to open his eyes, but he can't do it alone. He's going to do this. He's going to have to assemble the Avengers. We see a couple of cops harassing this poor homeless man, ready to take him in and do their worst to him, when all of a sudden their heads get bashed together. And a comforting voice and an outstretched hand assures the old man that everything is going to be okay. As people are watching the new Avengers on television, word is starting to spread. It's getting around that the real Captain America has returned. As Steve is meeting with Luke and his defenders, they're telling him that this is a different kind of war than the one he's used to fighting. This isn't one out on the battlefield, this is one in Americans' minds. They tell the Sentinel of Liberty his plan, how they're going to get him into Times Square, how they're going to hack into the news and the local radio stations where security will be at its weakest. Then they can let Steve Rogers be the voice of reason. There's an illusion of freedom going on in this country, and Steve has to be the one to shatter it. Meanwhile, James Stark and Kyle Jarvis are briefing the president on their current situation with the Star-Spangled Man. Jarvis tells the president he advises him that resistance will grow unless you step on it and crush it. While they're suggesting that they should send in the Thunderbolts to deal with this, the president angrily refuses. He tells him that he won't be sending them in on U.S. soil. Tells Jarvis that he's just some CEO of a company, that he is the president. This infuriates Jarvis. He grabs the president by the tie and tells him that he is the CEO of this country and the president is nothing more than a mascot. While the Thunderbolts are being prepped for their assignment of taking down Steve Rogers, see, Steve is doing some recruiting of his own as this mother sends her kids off to school. Symbol of Truth sneaks in and tells Kamala that he needs her help. He tells her he understands how much of a risk he's putting her in. He knows that she has a life and loved ones to protect, so she needs to understand just how important what he's about to say is. He tells her that he's so sorry, but it's just him, Luke, and a couple of kids, barely older than hers, fighting for a world where those kids don't have to be afraid anymore. They need to fight now, so that her kids don't have to. While she sternly tells him to get out, before he leaves, he tells her that those kids that he's working with, they've told him stories. Stories about people fighting back, about people helping, about people being saved by a giant hand, like the hand of God, if you could even believe it. He slides out the window. He tells her the Dark Avenger protocols are in place if she ever needs to get in touch. Later at Times Square, we see Steve getting ready and thinking to himself that he knows it's not fair to ask Kamala to ruin her life like he's done. Hard to reconcile the plight of the downtrodden with the smiling faces of the crowds oblivious to what's going on around them. Steve decides that it's time to fill them in. While the defenders are hacking into the broadcast center, unfortunately they get made and they tell Steve that he has 2 minutes. 2 minutes of these kids fighting for their lives to get this message out. 2 minutes that they can't get this broadcast to stop going on air. The poor kids quickly realize how outmatched they were because these aren't normal cops. These are Thunderbolt troops. Steve rushes in and joins in the fight, and even with the super soldier serum coursing through his veins once more, his body still isn't exactly what it used to be. And with no shield, he has no way to stop bullets, no way to keep people from getting hurt. Absolutely livid, Cap begins beating these soldiers' heads in, telling them that there's hundreds of innocent people here. He's fighting with everything he has. Little does he know, Bullseye has him in her sights. Finally, amongst all this chaos, they successfully get a mic in the Symbol of Truth's hands. He tells them all that he's Steve Rogers. They know who he is, and they know what he stands for. Their government has stolen their freedom away. This new Watcher Act isn't there to protect them or protect their privacy. There so that they can't see what the government is really doing, can't see what they're doing to the rest of the world or to the disenfranchised. So that light can never shine on their crime, so you never see the people that suffer in order for you to thrive. That's not who we are. That's not who we're supposed to be. We're Americans. We should look out for people, and we don't turn our backs. Thunderbolt's captain is calling in and asking if he should take Steve and the rest of his defenders out. They tell him no, that won't be necessary. He's doing a good enough job of that himself. As the broadcast finally is cut off, there's no eyes on them anymore. They're given the go-ahead. They're clear to kill Steve Rogers. Steve and the rest of them go to make their getaway. We see Bullseye hesitating to pull the trigger when she sees him going back to save one of his soldiers. After all this is over, we see Jarvis telling James what he must do, that he finally has to take his role. He has to step up. He has to be Iron Man. Steve Rogers is a dog with a bone, and the only thing that's going to stop him is knowing that his friend's son is inside of that suit. Jarvis tells James that Tony Stark and Janet Van Dyne didn't birth a fool, and he didn't raise a coward. But then we see Jarvis being told that he's losing control. Jarvis simply says that it's patience, something that you didn't have on H-Day. He says you lost, and I watched it happen and thought to myself, how the hell does a robot not have patience, as we see Kyle Jarvis's real identity as the Red Skull who is teamed up with Ultron. To make matters worse, we see back at the Defender's base the news being broke to Luke Cage that Cap's speech didn't work. In fact, they've been monitoring the airways, and if anything, all it did was make people hate Steve Rogers and the Defenders even worse. Steve is taking this news pretty rough. He tells Luke that he can't believe that he's such a fool. He thought he could just tell people what's really going on and they'd just join into the fight. He thought that their freedoms mattered to them, that flag he wraps himself in mattered to them. Luke then smacks Steve and tells him that there's no time for his American dream speeches. Do this shit to be liked. They do it because it's the right thing to do. There's bad people that need to be stopped, and they're going to be the ones that stop them. It would be nice if the whole world was with them, but if not, they'll do it on their own like they always have. But it turns out that they're not completely on their own, as we see them being given the files that has taken the Defenders months and months to obtain. They need help, and they plan to get it from the world's smartest man, Tony Stark. He's leading the resistance. Steve Rogers hasn't been able to sleep much recently, not since finding out that Tony was still alive. But Steve's been helping a group of teenagers calling themselves the Defenders, a bunch of freedom fighters that needed somebody to lead them. But this mission he's taking on is his fight, and he doesn't want these kids to die for him. The tech whiz of the Defenders has been working on a specialized signal that Steve had asked for. It's a very old distress signal that he doesn't think he'll have to use, but wants the Hail Mary in his back pocket in case he was to need it. Tyler realizes what Steve's doing. He's going to the raft, and he's going to try and break Tony out, all on his own. And while he respects his nobility, he tells him that it would be foolish to go without the guy who can override all of their security. At the raft, we see James Stark having a talk with his father, telling him that he finally made himself an armor, not a drone that he's been making for the army or for the president, but an armor made for him to become the next Iron Man. He tells Tony that he's just as smart as he was, hell, maybe even smarter. Because while Tony and his mom just flew around punching bad guys, calling themselves heroes, James says that he's actually saving the world. We see Steve and Tyler rapidly approaching the raft in one of the old Avengers Quinjets that Steve had kept in hiding. Before the two enter into the raft, Steve tells Tyler to stop here. He's done great that he's got him this far, but what comes next is far too dangerous for him, and the Defenders are going to need him. Tyler's a good kid, he's incredibly smart, but he's not a soldier, and the raft is no place for civilians. While the raft used to function as a high-security prison for the villains that the heroes caught, the government doesn't need it for that anymore. They execute all their villains. No, they've turned the raft into something much more heinous, a monstrous research facility. Steve has to watch and do nothing as he sees these experiments going on unwilling subjects, and every part of him wants to rush in there and shut it all down. He's fighting a war, and in war, you have to make the hard decisions. Right now, he has to free Tony, and the rest of it will come. Steve successfully kidnaps one of the scientists, takes his lab coat and his keycard, and finally, for the first time in years, was reunited with an old friend that he had thought long gone. Horrified at the condition that they've left Tony in, he questions whether or not he should have told Tyler to stay behind. He doesn't know how he's going to get Tony out of here. Then a voice from the rafters asks him if it's a little too complicated for you, old man. See, the new bullseye for the Thunderbolts had figured that Steve was coming to get his old pal. He's old and pretty predictable. He says that she almost feels bad to drop him, but orders are orders, and he is, after all, a terrorist. He tells her that that's what they're telling you, and you're just a soldier following orders, and it's easier when you don't have to hear the truth. Before she can make a move, they're interrupted when James has come to visit his father again. Steve tells James how disgusted he is with what he's done with his dad, that this isn't right, and he has to know that it's not right. James tells him what Steve is doing isn't right either, taking his geriatric steroids and beating up cops because the world isn't the way that he likes it. Yeah, he may throw some people in prison that never get heard from again, but most of the citizens in this country are entertained, fed, and happy. Some whiners want to fuck that up for everybody? Yeah, throw him in a pit for all I care. While he's threatening Steve to call in the new Avengers on him, Bullseye from the ceiling decided to put an arrow in the shoulder of the richest man in the world. Steve asks why the change of heart, why now, why help him, and she doesn't have an answer. But what she does know is how to get Tony out of here, and we see the two putting Tony's head into a smaller tank so that they can leave. Unfortunately for them, James has called a security breach. And as they go to make their escape, Steve tells Bullseye his one rule if she's going to be working with him now: no killing. Steve's confused as Bullseye is leading him out of here. She's taking him in the opposite direction of the ship, but she had another idea. He thought, the escape would go a lot smoother Steve was made whole. Cap hadn't realized it at the time. He had thought that his age had made him feel incomplete. With the serum back in his veins, sure, he can lead armies, but with the shield, he can do anything. As Cap and Bullseye have finally made it out of the raft, we see them being stopped by James in his brand new Iron Man suit. Bullseye is shooting at him absolutely helplessly, and while James uses his repulsor blast to blow the two apart, all of a sudden he gets shot in the back by Tyler piloting the Quinjet, but unfortunately, it did not have near enough firepower for this new Iron Man armor. And in retaliation, the Quinjet quickly gets taken out of the sky. Tyler's in a free fall, his life is on the line, and Steve tells Bullseye to shoot the windshield out. He begins running as fast as he can, moving his old bones, telling himself over and over that nobody dies today. While James is busy trying to kill Bullseye, we see the Sentinel of Liberty busting through the cockpit of the jet, pulling Tyler to safety because nobody dies while Captain America lives. And for a second, James is honestly impressed by his old uncle. The second is over quickly when he decides to level the playing field by literally leveling the battlefield. The raft is absolutely shattered. People, the guards working there, are falling into the water everywhere, and Cap is still trying to save them. James tells him how ridiculous all of this is, that he is the past trying to fight the future. Steve tells him he's doing what he has always done. He fights for the future. Steve begs James to stop this, that people are dying, and asks Steve, if you want to save people, our rules, our laws that you hate so much, they do just that. The two of them slugging it out as guards continue to fall in the water all around them. He says that all it takes are a few hard measures. Steve tries to tell James how lost he is, and throwing his own dad's head away into the water below, he tells him that he doesn't need him. He doesn't need anyone. Cap tells him, everyone needs help, son. That is what makes it all work. And as we see the water below the raft beginning to rumble, we see Miss Marvel rising up out of the river, pulling everyone to safety. Steve tells him that that is what makes the world work. James is still refusing. He's fighting just as hard as ever, and Steve is giving it everything he has. Unfortunately, this suit, this power, it's just way too much. He beats Steve onto the ground and tells him that he is James Stark and he runs the world. With an exhausted and trembling voice, Steve tells him that he has met men like him, and they don't run the world for long. Power resides in the people, but James cuts his Uncle Steve off and tells him goodbye, that his dreams are just a little too dangerous. He readies his repulsor beam to fry Steve in half. He gets hit by a massive bolt of lightning. Laying on the ground on his hands and knees, frying and smoldering inside of his suit, he asks Steve what the hell he did. Steve tells him he did what he always does in hard times. He prayed. After the thunderous arrival of Thor and Miss Marvel, Steve Rogers knows that his battle with James Stark is all but won. Thor offers Cap a helping hand because obviously James is hell-bent on going down swinging, but instead, Steve asks his old friend to help him clear the raft. Because as long as Cap can help it, nobody dies today. The only problem with that is the government had other plans. We see they ordered an airstrike on their own facility, on their own men, just to try and stomp out the small resistance that the Sentinel of Liberty has put together. The good news is, these pilots are too young to remember the age of heroes, to remember who the Avengers were, and they've forgotten whose sky they're flying in. We see James taking to the skies and retreating, and Thor offering to hunt him down, to go after him, to put an end to all of this. But Cap demands that Thor lets him go, that people here are dying, that they need their help, and James needs to go and think about what he's done and what kind of man he wants to be. Back at the Defender's secret base, we see Steve's ex Rosa working hard, treating all of the guards that the Avengers had managed to save. While she's still pissed at Steve for blowing their lives to pieces, and she doesn't want anything to do with him, she's still quick to come to his defense. He's being criticized for saving these guards, for saving their enemy, but Rosa explains that Steve believes that every life is worth saving. Everyone can lose their way and be brought back to the light, and while yeah, it's frustrating to hear him say it, when you see him act on it, he can really make you believe for a moment in heroes. Finally reunited, we see the Avengers catching up after all of these years. Thor apologizes to Steve for not seeing him for so long and explains the burden of immortality. How there comes a point where he can no longer face the people he cares for, how they wither away and suffer right in front of him, and he can do nothing about it. Thor is ashamed to admit that he doesn't have the courage to face the one enemy that will always win. And that is time, as we see the God of Thunder using his hammer to bring back what is left of one of his aging friends. In a panic, Tony wakes up and immediately says his son's name and tells him that he is so sorry. Tony explains that he's been watching helplessly for decades as his boy has spiraled closer and closer to fascism, and there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. He then reveals the truth to everyone and tells them that America hasn't been slowly twisted over the years like his son by pure happenstance, but rather the Red Skull pretending to be Jarvis's brother. He tells them of the Skull's real plans, his ambitions of taking over the military and revealing himself to the world. And at Stark Tower, we see the Skull putting his plans into motion, telling James how the Avengers made him look like a fool. He tells James that his parents and their friends had kept the world in a perpetual state of chaos, and now they're trying to undo all of the peace that they have brought to this country. He tells James James his real name, who he really is, and tells him that Tony Stark is not his father. The truth is, the Red Skull raised him, and the two of them are in this together. We then see Tony for the first time in years out of a tank, testing out his new body, and catching up with his old best friend. While Steve asks him if he's doing okay, Tony honestly tells him no. But forward is the only way. He tells his old friend that he doesn't remember much after H-Day. He knows that him and Jan had escaped Boston, and the two of them were planning to start a new life with their son. He remembers that he had a plan, but then all he can remember after that is pain. He has no idea what happened to his wife, but Steve promises him that if she's alive, they'll find her. And Tony promises that if she's not, she will be avenged. Tony then shows Steve some footage of what he believes will be their biggest obstacle in their coming war. They call themselves the Avengers, but Steve says that they won't call themselves that for long. Wanting to get the upper hand on this new team, we see Steve, Tony, and the Avengers covertly breaking into their old home. But they're absolutely shocked to see just how much the mansion has remained the same. Now, the intel that they've been given said that the new Avengers had just left, so Tony immediately goes to the command center to hack in and see what kind of weaknesses that they could possibly have, only to pull up their files and come to the realization that the Avengers aren't even real. And then we see the Skull calling in and telling them that the Avengers exist to the world that they help keep in line. He tells them, sure, they're not real, but it's what they represent that will stop you. He tells them all, you've been defeated by giving Americans everything that they could ever want. Prosperity by ignorance, blind eyes to the suffering of other people, and to America's militaristic treachery. But the Skull then informs them that he will be more than happy to, for once, tell his people the truth, that the Avengers of yesteryear are dead. Steve screams for everyone to run, to get out of the building now. Tony, of course, didn't listen. He was hacking into the Skull's local files, and he was just too hell-bent on stopping him, on saving his son, and we see the mansion go up in flames around him. But as the smoke clears, we find out that Tony had lived, but while he survives, he tells the rest of his team that the dream is dead. The Skull has already done it. He's already seized control of the U.S. military. He's going to burn Washington to the ground. We see the Red Skull preparing himself and telling James that the two of them have been running the country in secret for over a decade now, and it's time for them to make it official. We see James Stark examining the Skull's new armor for defects and quickly realizing that he can find none. While this news is both surprising and pleasing to the Red Skull, he tells James to suit up because today is the day they save America. The Skull then quickly turns around and destroys the suit's creator. See, he never intended to honor his partnership with Ultron. After all, machines serve men and men serve the Red Skull. As Johan takes flight for DC, we see that the Avengers are doing the same. We see Steve prepping his team. After all, they are up against the full force of the military and law enforcement who have all been fed propaganda and lies. They believe in their hearts they're helping to stop a rogue president. They're soldiers that believe what they're doing is right, and that makes them the most dangerous people in the world. We see the Red Skull storming into the Oval Office, eagerly telling the president exactly what he's done. The Avengers receive word that the White House has already fallen and, in desperation, send Tony ahead to try and stop the assassination of the former commander-in-chief. But as Iron Man comes busting in, he realizes that he's too little, too late. In a rage, Tony Stark begins hitting the Red Skull with everything he has, but Johan just laughs in his face and tells him how sad his life has been. Then, to add insult to injury, he tells Tony's son that it's time. As James suits up and heads out with his Iron Legion, he asks the Skull to give his father a message, to tell him he was much better off in the tank. Back at the White House, the rest of the Avengers make a thunderous entrance as they're trying to stop the storming of the Capitol. Even in the heat of this intense battle, as Cap rushes out of the Quinjet, he's reminding his team, no casualties. He knows these soldiers are fighting for a country, but it's a country that only exists in their minds warped over the years by the Red Skull. He is the very reason that Steve exists, and he is the reason that the old man can't die yet. As they continue their intense battle, the Skull tells Tony how pitiful it is to lose your country, your wife, and your son. And as he gets the best of the old man and knocks Iron Man to the ground, the Skull then orders an airstrike. A wave of missiles coming to burn the city to the ground to cleanse it of its rot so that a new democracy can grow. Iron Man immediately goes flying out of the building and breaking the news to his old friend. He tells him about the incoming missiles, how he's trying to go intercept him, how the Skull is still on the loose, and the president is dead. Immediately, Steve orders the new Hawkeye and Miss Marvel to go find the Vice President and keep her safe because she'll be hit next, while him and Thor prepare to face his oldest enemy. The Skull watches Steve fight and laughs in his face and tells him that yes, while he's fought a country before, now he leads nothing but mere children. These kids, these defenders, are huddled in shacks all across America, buildings that the Red Skull is having torn apart right now. Children that he's currently having murdered, or at least he thought. See, the problem with that is the defenders' safe houses are all already empty. We see Rosa telling Steve the news that everyone made it out safe, that backup is on its way, and that she loves him, and to make it home safe. Steve is hurting, his body's weak, his heart is broken, but he's not alone. He's not ready to die yet, and neither is his country. Meanwhile, Tony is desperately trying to stop and destroy all of the inbound missiles, but it's just too much. He's pleading to Captain America to send Thor in for backup. But backup isn't coming because his own son has jammed his signal. He begs his son to stop this madness, but James tells his father that if he wants the madness to stop, he needs to stay dead this time. Sure, yes, the skull may be killing millions now, but billions will be saved in the process. Tony tells his son that he loves him, and he knows he thinks in his head that what he's doing is right. Tony tells James that him, his mother, their friends, all they were ever doing was try to keep people safe, to protect them, to give them their freedom, and the Red Skull only really cares about control. While James is screaming at his father just to shut the hell up, Tony tells him that he's flattered. See, his son didn't change his designs up too much, and while Tony isn't much on controlling people, he's really damn good at controlling machines. As we see that during this fight, he has hijacked the remote control interlink on the entirety of the Iron Legion. Just like that, the tides begin to turn. Miss Marvel and Hawkeye have secured the Vice President. Steve and Tony are battling ferociously against the Red Skull, and while yes, he is a bit of a handful at the moment, he tells them what's going on. He says that he is the soul of the Red Skull, but he is the power of Ultron, which make Thor and Cap really happy to hear because they routinely beat his ass too. As James and Tony continue their battle in the sky, we see the Iron Legion successfully taking out the Red Skull's missiles. But spiking his father through the Washington Monument, James tells Tony that he doesn't understand what he's just done. They could have pulled this off with minimal casualties, but now with those missiles gone, the Skull is going to drop a nuclear payload. Beating his father's head into the ground, he asks him over and over again, why do you always have to ruin everything? Tony relays this news to Cap, and he sends Thor barreling through the sky to try and interfere with the coward's ultimate weapon. And with Cap now facing the Skull one-on-one, Luke has decided that for old time's sake, he's going to save Cap's ass one more time. Cap tells the Skull he doesn't care if his plans took a millennium to make. No matter what, he will find a way to stop him again and again. He doesn't care how the world looks at him and his friends after H-Day, but the Skull once again finds himself amused. Tells Steve that after H-Day, America has been safer than ever. Did he never really wonder why? Did he really think it was just because him and all of his other heroes were gone? Did he never consider it was because now America had the ultimate weapon? You see Thor realizing what's happening. His heart sinks, his face drops as a nearby explosion destroys the battlefield. The Skull says it was never called H-Day because of you heroes. It was H-Day because of the Hulk. This all began years ago. We see a devastated little boy being given a ring. It was all that his father had left on him at the moment of his apparent death. With his mother nowhere to be found, James Stark is then introduced to his new caregiver, Kyle Jarvis, who quickly tells the boy that everything is going to be alright. And who would have guessed at that moment all those years ago would lead to this in the present day, where we see a helplessly mind-controlled Hulk tearing Washington piece by piece. Seeing all of this damage firsthand, Steve recognizes just how numb he had grown to seeing the atrocities that his country had committed around the globe, many of them at the Red Skull's ultimate weapon and his long-lost dear friend. With the sound of thunder, we see the golden god of the Avengers quickly evening the odds. While Cap is telling Thor to move this fight away from the civilians to make sure no one gets hurt, it turns out the Red Skull is going full scorched earth. Tell Steve, if the Hulk isn't going to destroy this nation's capital, its bombs will. Then see Tony apologizing to his son, telling him that none of this is ever what he wanted for James. Pleased with him and tells him that if that nuke touches down, it will destroy everything and everyone, and he knows in his heart of hearts that his son doesn't want that. As James raises up and starts screaming and continues arguing with his father, Tony gets distracted when he sees the ring on his finger. He finally remembers what happened, and as we see Iron Man activating this ring, his mind rushes back to that fateful night all those years ago. See, when the heroes were outlawed, Tony and Jan came up with a plan, a way for her to be with her son in case everything went bad, and of course, we all know that it did. And now, well, if Tony can't save his son's soul, maybe his mother can, as we see Janet bursting out of the ring, growing to giant size, and then plucking the Skull's nuke out of the sky. Janet, unfortunately, is quickly reminded of the rewards that come with being a hero as we see the Skull's repulsor beam blasting through her side. But shrinking back down, Janet's pain is quickly subsided by the loving embrace of her long-lost husband. But while these two Avengers are holding each other together, another two are tearing each other apart. Thor and the Hulk are hitting each other so hard they're traveling across the country in a matter of minutes. State by state, their battle continues raging on until eventually, we see the two of them reaching Phoenix, Arizona, where Thor is pleading with his old friend, begging Banner to try his best to take control. And Thor's words work, if only for a second. Banner manages to take control of his mind once again. He manages to choke out just a few words from the Jade Giant's mouth. Kill me. Now, back at the Stark family reunion in DC, we see Tony telling Janet that their boy is in serious need of a timeout, but right now, they have a coup they need to shut down. We see Luke Cage stopping one of the defenders from bashing in the head of one of these soldiers. He tells her that they have to do this, they have to fight like the world is watching because, well, they are. So we see that amongst all of this chaos, one of the defenders was able to hack into the government's prying eyes and turn them against them. We can see the Red Skull beating the absolute hell out of Steve, knocking him all the way on top of the roof of the White House, telling him that he's never really been a match. Tell Steve that he's a fool whose country stands for nothing, whose symbol is so easily co-opted. As he launches a flagpole through the stomach of the Sentinel of Liberty, he tells him that that symbol right there will become a siren call to fascism. He controls the media, the laws, he bathed in the blood of their puppet president, and they don't need a president when they have a Fuhrer. Steve is at a loss for words. He has nothing else to say to the Skull except for smile, because the world is watching. Tony then sweeps in and launches the Skull into a nearby building. In seconds, he's overwhelmed. He's attacked by the Wasp, Miss Marvel, Hawkeye, and James Stark. Destroying the arc reactor in his chest, we see the Red Skull go flying. Steve standing over his enemy, victorious. Raising his shield high above his head, the Sentinel of Liberty is more than happy to put the final nail in the coffin of the Red Skull's fascist regime. As the Red Skull suit begins to flicker out, so does Captain America's heart. And to make matters worse, the Red Skull is nothing if not prepared. He had a fail-safe built into his suit, and it's beeping and ready to go nuclear. But thankfully, the Starks are there to save the day. We see Jan trying to jumpstart Steve's heart, James taking the Skull and flying off into the sky, only to be quickly met by his father, who tells him that it's okay. Tells James that he's not mad, that in the end he came through, he really did. This isn't the end for him. He rips the Skull out of his hands and blasts his son back down towards the earth. He tells him, "You're just getting started, Iron Man." Meanwhile, in LA, we see nothing but devastation as Thor and the Hulk's battle has reached the other coast and its end. Thor plunges himself and Bruce into the water. And just like that, 4 founding members of the Avengers all have their lives on the line. With a huge explosion in space and an immovable hammer pinning a helpless monster to the ocean floor, only 2 of those Avengers would remain. Back in DC, we see the old man's life is saved and the mother and son are reunited. While James immediately begins to apologize, his mother gives him his first lesson on being an Avenger, that sometimes even when you win, you lose. A couple of weeks later, we see a nation in healing, Steve reunited with the love of his life and taking the time to meet up with an old friend. Because as Janet tells him, while things have been hard, yes, everything is harder without friends. So we see James tirelessly working to rebuild the Avengers' old home. Then, unfortunately, it's time for the God of Thunder to say goodbye. He asks for Steve's forgiveness about what happened with Banner, but he promises that it was his time. The only thing that Bruce wanted was a release. Thor then apologizes again for just being away for way too long, but promises to visit. And hugging him, Janet tells him that he better, that there's too few of them left. As the God of Thunder rides the Rainbow Bridge home, he tells her, yes, but more weight in the wings, as long as you continue to inspire. Thor wasn't the only Avenger heading home to the Golden Land of the Gods, as we see Tony Stark and Bruce Banner sitting side by side in Valhalla. Turns out that Goldilocks had pulled some strings for these 2 old warriors to enjoy a life of retirement together. Finally, at Avengers Mansion, we see Miss Marvel and Hawkeye offering James Stark a helping hand. He assures the 2 that it's fine, that he can do all of this himself, and Kamala tells him, sure, you can, but it'll be stronger, better, if we do it together.